All right, so today we're going to be talking about being security savvy in Angular and React apps. We're going to talk about all the things with plenty of memes to come. Okay, so first off, who am I? Why am I allowed to talk about this, or why should you trust me? I'm Chris. I'm a father of two. In the last presentation we had a Nerf war. I super appreciated that because that is my house on a pretty regular schedule. My son shooting at me, and I shooting back, of course. I've worked with Angular since pretty much the beginning. So right around like 0.8 up to 1.4.7, and then of course up to 5 now and 6 coming out. Angular Elements looks pretty cool. I've also worked with React here and there. I have not worked with React a ton professionally, but I have lots of friends that worked on it, and we've talked about these kind of things. So if you ask me something React specific, I may say, let me defer to this person, or we can look up for the exact parallel. And then of course, as far as like the back end, what I've been talking to, I'm mostly working in .NET. I've been programming for 14, 15 years now. Okay, so the second you walk out of here, the first sarcastic person that you talk to is probably going to ask, are you security savvy now? Which you will applaud that joke. And it's good to be around sarcastic people, especially if those are the kind of people that if you try to roll something out around like 4 o'clock on a Friday, you can get a good sarcastic answer that implies we probably should not be doing that, okay? So what really are we covering today? What are we going to go over? Well, let's give an example. So all as devs, we've been there. We've been in that meeting, that presentation, that quote, whatever you're doing, and you get the questions. Questions of, what's the best way for us to authenticate our users, right? So if you're talking about things like Oauth, cookies, all sorts of fun stuff, and all the different flows you can take with Oauth, we're going to discuss those items. We're also going to talk about how to make sure the users don't access certain part of the application they're not supposed to. So in our single page applications, we have ways when we have an admin section or things like that. How do we make that work well, okay? We're also going to talk about how do we make sure they don't have to keep logging in constantly. So one part is you want a secure application. Users do not want to log in. They want to write their password once, and they want to never enter it again because everyone's lazy. So how do we make things like that work, but keep it safe at the same time? Okay? And then if you have user-generated content, you enter a whole fun world where everything can go wrong. And so how do we handle those kind of situations, or just say that we're not going to? And for the last one, the user session. So near the end, we're going to start talking about, okay, you may have a user session context or some situations where you have a token ID. Within that, how do you control that and keep it safe? And I think that's the most important thing we're going to talk about later today, because that's a big part in applications that we're seeing. Okay? So without further ado, let's talk about how we're going to break this down. So the first part is, we're going to have what we're going to go over in a very general sense, what it means from .NET. So not all of us may be familiar with front end as far as what it means where when the user comes in, how do we have all the things associated to it, where we know who they are, what they can access, those kind of items. And we're going to talk about that from a very simplistic standpoint, just so everyone else, once we jump into the Angular and React side of things, we can understand, okay, this is what we mean by role, this is what we mean by claims, all those different kind of items. Then we're going to talk about all the different ways that you can get a user to jump into that application, okay? So you can have it where they can use OAuth, the most common popular format. There's also an item where cookies and things like basic auth come into play, depending on how your backend API may be working, okay? And then we'll talk about the different token options. So once that user is authenticated, there's different ways you can store that token or have it persisted and what it may contain that can help your application or may involve security concerns. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to jump into the whole Angular React JS side of things, and we'll talk about where your stuff's being stored as far as authentication. We're going to talk about the risk, right? So scripting, someone forging a request from your user, and then best practices on how to handle that. Okay? So let's jump into authentication. So from the most simple standpoint, authentication from the backend side of things is you're going to get a user somehow. That user is going to give you an email, user ID, something. They're going to send in the password, and from that, you're basically going to know this user exists in our system, and they are authenticated. Okay? Then the question comes up, okay, they're authenticated, but what can they access? All right? So we didn't know administrators can only delete users. So they need to be an administrator in order to do that. Or content moderators are the only people that can flag or delete certain things. All these separate actions that happen, right? So how do we control that? So in .NET, that's in roles. So when I talk into the system about like, okay, only this person within a role should be able to do this, what I'm talking about is you have a role such as administrator, content moderator, etc. And users are typically assigned to groups on a manual basis. There are ways to automate that, of course, but that's what we're talking about. So to bring it into .NET, this sample silly API, on your backend, you may have something where you're completing a certain task within an action result, and you'll have in here an authorized attribute that says only these people can access it. Why this is important is eventually your Angular React app will be calling this, and if you call it and they're not within that role, they're getting an exception. So you can say either they're going to get that and that's how we'll handle that, or the application can know ahead of time. And so there's best practices there. Okay? Then of course things get even better. So maybe in your application you have it where I'm only going to trust certain people. So let's say you're in a content moderator role, but I want you to be a content moderator for at least 3 months or something before you can do something. And that's where things like claims and policies come into play. Okay? So a claim is an action or associated based security where I'm saying something only a certain with these particular claims or policies can do something. It also becomes even more abstract where a claim can be something as simple as a valid email address or a verified email, something where they're older than 18 years old, all these different kinds of situations. And it's designed in such a way that it can be very generic and it can also be very specific. Okay? So when we talk about claims and policies, this is what we're talking about. So again, an example of code, before .NET Core you had the claims authorization attribute. In .NET Core you have policies where you can assign those. And then on your API, this is what's important to us, is we have, okay, you have to be a moderator for at least 3 months before you can call this API. So real quick, for what we're going to care about once it goes to the JS side of things, is they're logging in somehow. They're going to have roles, claims, or policies where they can access certain items. And then we want a list of those permissions so we can say, don't show this menu. Or if they're going to try to do this action, tell them, you don't have access to this yet, those kind of things. Any questions? So that was a very world's fastest overview of just the basics. Any questions before we jump into things like how we're going to send credentials and start connecting? All right, let's go. So the most simple one is, let's say you have a backend API and you want it where every single time they send a request, they're going to send their credentials and you're going to send something back. Okay? So that can be basic auth, where even you see it when you like go to a browser this way, it'll pop up and say, hey, this is basic auth, give me a username and a password, and it'll send it off using a basic header. Okay? So from the Angular React side of things, you could technically do this, but it also means storing the username or password, even if you're storing it as a base64 version. So we typically don't see this in Angular React, but it is a form to authenticate. Okay? Next up is cookies. So this is your very common forms authentication, right? Where you have the app starts up, you log in, you post a particular page, it's going to create a cookie, and it's going to send it back to the user, and then you have session, right? So that session will store that cookie, or there's ways to persist that, of course, and then you'll know whenever they send that cookie that they are logged in. Okay? So each time you send it, the browser sends it over in the request. And now the fun parts, right? So Oauth. Is that a question? Okay. So Oauth is a protocol for authorization flows. Okay? It's very popular today. Pretty much any app that's being created these days, this is how it's going to authenticate. And what it boils down to is you have grant types or ways to get an access token, and you're talking to an authorization server. Okay? So we have our 4 main actors when we talk about OAuth and how our apps are going to be able to authenticate or call our APIs. Okay? So we have the authorization server. This is something that says the user is going to send their credentials or find a way to access the application somehow. And there's different grant types, so you have like implicit, authorization flow, etc., where someone's able to get that token. Once they have a token, then resource server or servers can see that token and then be able to use it to talk to the authorization server and say, does this user have access to this resource? And then be able to validate and let them continue on. And then of course, there's the resource owner, which is the user using your application, and then your application itself. Okay, so let's go over an example real quick, for those not familiar. So for instance, this is from Google. Like if I'm trying to use OAuth to authenticate to Google, let's talk about what's happening in OAuth. So your JS app, for instance, is going to send a token to Google that says, hey, I would like to gain access to what this user is doing. So certain things that I want to access, such as, let's say, their inbox or something within their data, their photos, who knows. The user gets sent off to the Google server and says, hey, this app would like to request it. I'm sure you've seen it where if you go to a certain page and it says, hey, we want access to your GitHub account, or we want access to Facebook, those kind of things. You're taking to Facebook, it shows the app, all that fun stuff. You sign in, and then it sends you back to the website with a response. Now, it still doesn't trust you, so it takes that response, sends it back to, in our case, Google. It validates the response, and then now it has that token that it can use to call the API. Okay? How many people here are using OAuth right now? Awesome. Okay. So the main points of OAuth are it provides a common authorization flow. Okay, so many sites and authorization providers, if your app uses this, you have a way to now automatically connect to everyone else, essentially. So you have different grant types. So what if you have a native app, whether you have a single page application that's hosted on the web, or you have your other first party APIs that are connecting, you have all these different ways that you can access that resource on behalf of that user. Okay? And the nice thing about this is that almost any language or framework that you use these days, Java, .NET, all down the line, it makes it very straightforward to connect to these. Okay? So once we connect via OAuth, we have an OAuth token. Okay? So a token is a scalable and stateless way where we can say, I am this user. So you're sending a token to your backend, the resource server, and you're saying, here I am, and it sends back the data you're looking for. Okay? So the token can either be scrambled nonsense, where we can say, all right, this is just random garbled data. We don't know what this means, but it gives us access to this user. Or it can be something like Json Web Tokens, where that token is transparent. We can unpack it a little bit and find out, oh, this means this or this means that for this user, those kind of things. Okay? Most implementations of OAuth that I have seen in .NET, as far as packages, or even not the one in default .NET Core, will have opaque tokens, but there's a lot more that are moving to transparent tokens, and it's really up to you on what you want to use. And we'll talk about the pros and cons. Any questions before I jump into transparent tokens and how those typically work or feel? Yes?
Are there any benefits of opaque tokens over transparent?
It depends. So I think one concern is like when you send, we'll look into how a token works in a little bit. Typically it'll say, this is the algorithm I'm using. So some people's concern is you're saying, I'm using this algorithm, and so it gives them a chance to possibly know a little bit more about what they could do with that token. That's kind of a weak argument, but that may be why. Also, with like we'll get into like OpenID Connect, and they have like other ways where you can know about the user, so you don't technically need the user's information within the token. All right, so Json Web Tokens is a standard. Or anyone else before I jump further? Because we gotta go over all these basics before we jump into the apps here. So this allows someone where they can securely transfer information where they know that token is secure, and then we, as the authorization server, can know that it's secure. Okay? So this structure typically for Json Web Tokens is you have a header over here, so that base64 string. You have a payload, and then you have a signature. Okay? So it's formatted as header.payload.signature. So if you ever go to app and you see like in your local storage, or if you see something with like a cookie or something, where you see something like this, chances are it may be a token like this. Okay? So if we take a look at our example as far as how we can use this, if we base64 decode the header, we'll see right here, so this is one of the arguments some people have. So my algorithm, I know I'm using AGIS-256. So somehow if AGIS-256 gets compromised or whatever, then they may have a way that they can create one of these tokens, right? And of course, it depends on how you're doing that encryption and stuff, but that's one of the arguments. Okay? So if I take my algorithm, so I'm basically AGIS-256, and I take my header and my payload, and I have my secret, which for us is Code on the Beach 2018, I now have my secret, and I can validate, okay, I created this. This token is authentic, and then go from there. Okay? So now we have our payload, and it tells us, here's who I am. I have the time the token was issued at, so IAT, and then I have my roles. So this is nice from an app standpoint where I can say, oh, I know I'm a content moderator, I know I'm an admin, and I can make decisions based on that. Okay? So a real quick review about how apps typically authenticate. So you have the bearer tokens that you see from OAuth, and you have cookies. Any questions before we start jumping into the meat and potatoes? Bert?
If you can see the roles and claims inside the token itself, can't you spoof them in your session since you're on the client side with the JS?
No, well, I mean, you could spoof them where you could still see whatever the app wasn't trying to show you, just to make it better for the user. But then once you send it to the actual server and it goes to validate your token, it's going to say this doesn't match up, and you're going to get rejected. Excellent question. Anyone else? All right. So let's start getting the argument of security in apps and how we want to handle this. Okay. So with cookies, your browser sends it automatically. For those that aren't aware, in cookies, there's things such as like same site or HTTP only, where you can define where that cookie gets sent around or what can access it. Okay. So your application doesn't have to store it, and it's a way to authenticate the user. With a bearer token, you send it on the authentication header in each request. So when you can make a request from your front-end application to your back-end application, something in that code is saying, here's who I am in the bearer token, and sending it to that back-end. So your token has to be somewhere your script can access it. This is where the problem starts, okay? So be aware this may not be the only thing you need to authenticate the user. So there's a mix sometimes of like a bearer token and a cookie that's still in the back-end. But that's what you commonly see where it's just that token. That's when we're going to start talking about being security savvy, all right? So we've gone over the basics. Let's start jumping into the Angular and React side of things. So we're going to talk about common implementations where you can store this and how that works. So each app is going to start where we have some way to log in, right? You're going to want their username, their email, some form of password, whatever it is, and they're going to log in. And there's a jillion ways from the backend side of things to tackle this, okay? So for instance, I can use a third party. So there's auth.0, there's Okta, if anyone has a preferred way to pronounce that. Then there's like Identity Server 4, which is a really popular one. JWT Bearer Authentication, which is like a default one in .NET Core, if you've ever set up a default .NET Core app. And then OpenID Dict, which is an OpenID Connect implementation. OpenID Connect is something that sits on top of Oauth that defines things just a little bit further. So you have a framework there. And then of course, if for some reason you wanted to say you have to have a Facebook or some kind of social account to use the site, then you could say we'll use Facebook or Twitter, okay? So we're going to go into like the different pros, cons here. I get asked a lot on what I recommend, which is not a normal thing that happens. But if you want to know, my default that I set up is I set up Identity Server. I like Identity Server. There's like 100 bajillion examples of what you may want to run into. So you may have it where I just need to set up a site, I need to get something running, and if you set this up and need to expand it later, I like the different things that I control there. Jeff Fritz, for example, has super detailed articles on how to set this up. It makes it really simple to plug into. If you have something where you end up using like a mix of bearer tokens and cookies, there's different ways to plug them in as well, and so I do really like that. But let's talk about why you may want to do that, okay? We can skip this. So a lot of people ask for if they have an app, what's the best way from a grant type for Oauth to connect? So you'll typically see a lot of people use authorization or hybrid flow. That's typically what I'll use as well. There's people that use a grant type of password, where if you have a first-party app, you can literally have the user type in your email, your password, etc., and that app will send it directly to the authorization server to get a token. And there's pros, cons to that, because if later you want to tie in like a regular authorization flow, like right now you can sign in with your username and password, and I want to allow Facebook and Twitter, now you're doing a different grant type to make that work. And there's different like plugins and frameworks that can make that work and easy. So don't be scared of authorization flow if you're setting up an app, but if you have a first-party app, password may be easier, okay? But that's just my default that I normally set up. So let's talk about different storage solutions, okay? So when we have cookies, you can have the user submit to a request to your authorization server, just like you have when you're logging into Forms Auth or web pages, MVC, all those different kind of items. So you'll have them post directly to that page, they'll send the information they need to authenticate, and that server is going to send them back a cookie. And that cookie is going to be the authentication. Now, some things that get tricky there, as far as how you have all your different apps working, is the domain of that API and your cookie now have to match. Because the cookie that you send back is going to be tied to a domain, and when you send a request to authorize on that backend, that cookie needs to be sent as well, because that's how you're authenticating the user. For token-based authentication, you can send a request to get a token, and you'll usually get a refresh token as well. You have to store this somewhere, all right? And this is where the risk evolves. So let's talk about those pros, cons. So if you store something in a cookie, scripting is less of an issue, because all they're basically going to be able to do is they can still authenticate on your behalf if they get that script, which is definitely still a problem, but it's not like they can take that token and then go ham with different items against it. But now you're more possibly vulnerable to cross-site request forgery. So if you have that cookie and someone has a different app and they say, hey, go call this from their own site, that cookie still gets sent, and then now you're out of luck. With local storage or session storage, scripting is now the biggest deal ever, because depending on what all that token stores, or what are you allowed to access as far as your backend API, you can be super SOL. And as far as how you deal with like cross-site request forgery, you control domain and mitigation, and we'll get into that, and it's slightly easier as far as the request forgery. So these are our two main concerns. Now for those not familiar, I'm going to go over real quick how that happens and how you prevent against it, okay? So here's an awesome example. So Ryan, this dude, back in Angular 1, put an example up of what scripting or cross-site scripting means and how they can use it to take advantage of your site, okay? So I don't know if you guys have used Plunker before, but Plunker is a website where you can say, I want to host this code real quick and show someone, hey, here's a snippet of code and here's how it works, that kind of thing. So when you sign in, you can link it to like GitHub, all sorts of stuff, so you can sync it to your repository. Really nice tool, right? Well, there was a problem with it. So they had it in Angular where they were able to, in the description, if you see over on the far left, he has 1 equals equals 1, and he has it in between this description, right, with X. And he realized that it was updating the title of the page and then putting it within the title. So if you see there X, true X on that title, they were now able to run that script, right? Now he looked in his local storage and found out, when I'm authenticated to GitHub, my token is stored right here, my service token, along with the ID, in local storage. So now what he did is he said, okay, I'm going to set this particular session item, and I'm going to make an image request, and I'm going to send that session ID. So now what he did is he said, hey, look at this cool Plunker thing that had the site with an ID. Anyone who was logged into GitHub that loaded the site, he got an image request that included that token. Make sense? Any questions before we jump to the next part? All right. The next part is cross-site request forgery. So let's say you have an API where you say, okay, you can like a video and pass the video ID. If you're using cookies as a way to authenticate, if I make a page where I say I want to boost certain likes to a video on my system, I can make a post request where I say, hey, go ahead and send it to that particular API to like a video and pass that ID. Anyone who now has a cookie is going to send a request to that, and now all these people are seeing these liked videos in their account when they didn't do that. They just went to my website, right? But I did that in the background, and I was able to fake that request. Okay? So our main concerns here then, as far as these apps, is we have authentication. We need to authenticate our users. We need to have some way to store a token, a cookie, something where we can say, okay, they can get into our app, and how do we make it where they can stay in that app safely? The next one is if we have it where they can run a script, or if they can get away with that particular token. So if we have things like user-generated content, or something where they're entering data and they can take advantage of that, that's going to be a problem. Also, third-party content and used libraries. So let's say they're using something from NPM or whatever else, you install the latest, it includes some kind of package or whatever else, and that package is compromised, then now you have a possibility where you're losing your stuff as well. And then of course, ads. If you run ads on your site, depending on which ad site you're using, if it gets compromised, now that stuff is running there as well. Typically you won't have them run scripts, but some do. Okay? So the big question becomes, how do we mitigate this risk? So if I have something in that session token or local storage, how do I stop from being vulnerable to attacks? So quick question. Who here, as far as using Angular and React, is storing a session token in local storage? Okay, don't be ashamed. It's not the end of the plane or anything. Who here is using cookies for authentication? Anyone? Okay.
We're using Okta. I think Okta stores it in session storage.
We chose to store it.
Yeah.
But we use Okta token and we chose to store it in session storage. Local, whatever tab specific. When you open a new tab, it's not logged in on the new tab.
Yeah.
I can't remember the difference between the two right now.
Yep, session storage. You're spot on. Okay. So as far as local storage, super simple to use. If I'm running a site and I want to send a token or whatever else, you just throw it right in there in a script and say, grab it from local storage, and that's all we're doing. But now, since that token is needed, we're adding risk. So the best way to handle that is you can do things with like a content security policy. So who here knows what a content security policy is? Okay, awesome. So a content security policy is a way on the page to say, hey, we only want to access these sources, these image. If someone tries to click on a link or certain, like all these different items you can control, but typically you'll say where only these domains are trusted within here. So for instance, you'll see on a lot of sites where you say, I'll support all these different image locations. So Amazon, my CDN, all that stuff, I'll support images from here. But as far as what scripts can run on my site, I only support from my own local domain and then whatever else you're using. So like if you have a CDN, you may trust that as well as far as your scripts. If you don't, and you have like inline source as like the default is trusted, some able to run that particular JavaScript and then gain access to your token. Okay? So local storage plus same site cookie, this is more work. So I think someone had mentioned Okta where you can control, you can say I want it in local storage, but also I want something on the back end that's controlling that session value that says when you send a token, I'm also going to validate it against a cookie as well. I haven't used Okta in production, but I've heard good things about it, so that's awesome. It does make validation harder. So this is something you're running on your own, and you're saying, okay, I have that local storage token that I'm using, but now I have a cookie on the back end. You run into this whole is it stateless thing where you have to also check against that typically in Redis or sometimes in session storage where you're validating it almost just like a regular cookie for forms auth. So XSS is possible. They can still make calls to your API, but as far as like what calls they could make or how that would work against the cookie, they don't have that cookie anymore unless they're just getting as far as the user. but as far as getting that image and stuff, they couldn't make it from an external source. So if they have like GitHub, not that you're GitHub, but like if that's the token that gets away, when they fake that request and send the token, they won't have the cookie as well, and now they don't have access. Okay? So how do things like this happen? Okay, so in Angular, and I love the way React spells it, a lot of these security compromises that happen is from offline from trusted HTML. So for instance, what you saw in Plunker was they had it in the original Angular 1 where they said, we're going to go ahead and run this, and we're going to trust this in HTML where they can put in the description. So if my description is like bold, see this now, end bold, whatever else, then you'll see it in the title where they have to have that bold. They link in the description on the page and also in the title, but that ended up in the actual DOM. So the ways to get around this in Angular is you can call stuff like bypass security trust HTML. That should sound scary for a reason. React gives it the best name ever. I would love to congratulate and high five the person. Dangerously set inner HTML. You should feel super comfortable typing that. So if this is something where you're building a site, even if it's entirely first party, and you find yourself writing this line of code, stop and think about what you're doing. Because you're immediately putting yourself at risk as far as where that token is, okay? So let's talk about the top 5 to prevent this, okay? So if you're in Angular, you have an offline template compiler. Now if you're in Angular 2 or higher, and when you build Angular and you type -- prod, that automatically enables -- AOT, which is ahead of time compilation, okay? And what that's going to do is it's going to pre-compile all your views and everything, so that way as far as what it's doing on the actual application when it runs on prod, is nothing is being executed or generated at that point. Make sense? You can also implement a content security policy. This is a really easy win, because what you're going to say is, these are the only places that I'm allowing my users to connect. So for instance, if I say from an image source that I'm only going to allow images from these locations, and we have the same thing that we had on Plunker, where they were loading that image would never connect. Because the browser would see, hey, I'm not allowed to get images from here, so it's going to get in your console window, you're going to see, hey, someone tried to connect to here, but the content security policy does not allow it, okay? Because a lot of times when they get access, a lot of times images are ignored, and so they'll just put in the image, session token equals X, and now they have access, okay? Next one is user-generated content through a whitelist, what I like to call a blender, a very small whitelist. If you have user-generated content, sometimes it's just an evil we have to face, depending on the client's requirements and what we're building. But if you do, you need to work with the client on what's the strictest amount of stuff that you can get in there. So a lot of times you'll see where only certain tags are allowed. They'll have things like where only markdown is allowed, those kind of things. That's something that we've done to make sure that once we have that content that we're bringing in for like our shopping cart experience, we're making sure that content is safe. Because the second we trust it, if they can run a script and they can execute it, then we're in trouble, okay? And then of course, scrutinize every single usage of any of the bypass security functions. There was an awesome presentation earlier that talked about pre-commit code reviews. One of the things I'm definitely going to bring back is I want a way before someone commits something, if that code is even remotely in there or like hinted at in a comment, I want a way to be like, don't do this, stop now, think, those kind of things. And then of course, audit and test regularly. We're moving right now on our own site where we're going to start having a checkout feature as far as our shopping cart. Originally it was on another server that we're bringing to. Now we're having checkout with an Angular. Before we even start doing that, we're going to have someone come and audit it because these things are super important. You can't risk these tokens getting away. So there's a cost to it, but it is worth it. Okay? All right, so as far as the cross-site request forgery, we have it where if you have a cookie, you can set same site. So not only HTTP only, which means it's only sent across the server, but also same site. So what that means is that if you have cookie authentication and someone on another site is trying to send a request, your browser is going to realize, hey, that's not from the same site. I'm not going to send that cookie. Okay? A quick warning though, IE11, the best browser absolutely ever. If the origin and refer are the same or of a different subdomain, it ignores it. It's weird. So you could spend a good while. We talk about cores and all the different ways to check from that cross origin. But typically you set same site, you are fine. Another way is anti-forgery tokens. So like if you work with web forms or MVC, you have it where you have a form and you say, generate an anti-forgery token. And then when you post it on the page, you validate that anti-forgery token before you commit anything else. You can do the exact same thing here, where you request it, process it, and then continue with a request. All right, the next part is being sure as far as when we have the application, how do we know what rights or roles our users are associated to? So for instance, if we're using Json Web Tokens, so like the default .NET Core, you can have it where you say enable JWT bearer authentication, and then when you have your app with that token, if you're in Angular React, there's tons of libraries, and I think Angular by default now where you can say, what role am I within as this particular user? And so you can say, don't show this menu unless you have the admin role. Don't show this menu unless you have the content moderator, making things easier for the user. If you don't have something like JSON Web Tokens or a transparent token, a lot of times you'll see it where like in OpenID Connect or Auth applications, we'll make a request for the user to say, what's my roles or my profile as part of the discovery? And so we'll get back a request that says, here's all the roles or things you have access to. One of the nice things about Identity Server 4 that I like is that I can say, only show these particular roles. Because let's say that I have a role where like your account is past due, or you're a super awesome person and I'm going to keep you as a customer no matter what, but I don't exactly want you to know that. You can have a list of roles where only those roles are returned, just so things don't get awkward. Okay? So of course, we're transparent. The roles are immediately known. Depending on how many roles or policies you implement, that sucker can get super lengthy. So just be aware as far as how you implement and what you allow to get sent back, how that works. And then as far as opaque tokens, you'll need some way, like we said, to connect to that. Most libraries do have it covered. And they do allow pretty liberal extensions as far as what you do want to reveal within that profile. All right, now the fun part. Any questions before we start talking about refresh tokens? OK, so this is one of the this is where we could argue for 20 minutes about how to allow this work. You'll see a lot of setups where someone says, hey, we're going to make authentication work in Angular or React. And they're going to show like an awesome example. And then what they do is they have the local storage keep the access token and the refresh token. Okay? Now this runs into an issue. If I can somehow get a hold of that, and I have your authentication token and your refresh token, I now have a way to not only gain access on your behalf, depending on how CORS is set up, but I also can continually gain access for that refresh token. So there's a lot of policies we can do as far as how we enact that. So what I typically like to see is where if someone logs in, we use authorization flow, and we send that request back where, OK, you now have access to the site, you'll also send a cookie that contains the refresh token. That refresh token has same site only and HTTP only. So what that means is as long as I'm logged into that computer or that particular instance, and I'm sending the request where, hey, I would like to re-authenticate this user, you have two parts to that puzzle that are working together, where you have the original token as far as your storage, and you have the cookie that's both being sent. I know who this is, and now I can grant them a new authorization token and reset the cookie for the refresh token. Okay? And I think you said Okta does this by default or can be selected, so that's awesome. But of course, there's like extra work there where you're sending those things. In Identity Server 4, this is an option for refresh token. You select to not send it back, and then you can say when you send that request back for the authorization token to add that cookie. Okay? But then of course, you need a way to validate that cookie on the server, so that's extra work every time you're doing that. Okay? So it's tricky, but there's pros, cons, of course, security as far as how you contain that. Okay? Should the user ever enter from a new IP? So this is something I'm strongly a believer in, or if we have suspicious activity, go ahead and revoke that refresh token. You'll see certain applications where they're as crazy as where like they'll do it every like minute, 30 seconds for a token to refresh and keep going back and forth to keep getting that new token. So if anything funky ever happens, they can just immediately invalidate it. Okay? So typically for us, if we see someone log in and they log in from another external IP, we'll typically just nuke that refresh token so they have to re-log in. It's not great for the user, but if something looks fishy, then we're able to catch that.
Yeah, so like someone uses Tor or proxy from China, that's bad user experience, given that their IP changes.
Oh, yes, right. We have not run into someone using Tor for our shopping cart, but that's a good point because I think it changes, I forget how often with Tor, it's almost every request, right? Yeah. Yeah, then that's not going to work. So we may have to have something where if you see that, then we can do something else, or that does make it difficult.
Yeah. Pretty sure Tor users are used to having a crappy browser experience.
Yeah, we have not had that caller situation yet, but that's a very good point. So you may say like, okay, if for some reason your application is highly used by Tor users, which may make you wonder why it's being highly used by Tor users, you may want to figure out how you can make that work, or just you don't do anything based on IP. That is an excellent question, though. I have not thought of that. Okay. Next one's for social logins. Man, I see this get murdered all the time with social stuff. I see a lot of integrations where people will do all this work just to have like a retweet button or something. So let me just strongly encourage that if all you need to do is like tweet something or like a page or whatever else, there's a lot of way to do that just in JS based or whatever else. But if you need to make it where you're going to have you're authenticating on behalf of that user for Facebook or Twitter, I'd strongly recommend all that stuff happens on the server side. The second you bring it on the client side or whatever else, you risk getting that token. Now both Facebook and Twitter have ways for the domain as far as what you allow to support from that stuff, so that makes it safer, but you are still putting yourself at risk. Okay? So I think Twitter, it mandates the secret on every single request. So I don't think Twitter you can do client side anymore. You have to use the JS library, but there are other ones that would allow that. So I think they're realizing like this is an issue and like either use the JS library or do it all from the server side. Any questions on that? Awesome. Okay. So in review, we went over roles, claims, policies, the whole 9 yards just to understand what all we're trying to get across. We have the different ways someone can authenticate. Okay, so like let's say that you have someone where you have an API. You may want your basic auth where someone who's an admin is trying to access that API. And then you have OAuth or cookies where you can have users authenticate and stay authenticated. We talked about opaque versus transparent tokens. So this is Json Web Tokens. We talked about the 1 million ways where you can handle authentication in your apps as far as the backend is concerned. And then we talked about some of the important things to consider security-wise in our apps, such as scripting, cross-site request forgery, content security policies is a big win, and the different authentication setups and refresh tokens. And with that, I think I'm a little early, but are there any questions?
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure. Oh, this presentation will be online in about 30 minutes for anyone that concerns.
Where online will it be?
I'm going to tweet it here in just a second.
Okay.
Sorry. If you do not have a Twitter account, we'll send a link. So there's about 1 billion things that I wanted to cover today, and I know I went through a lot of stuff super fast. There's a lot of different really weird situations where you can get into some super fun stuff. The hard part is to nail 50 minutes on just that can be a little tough. So one thing I have at the end here for this presentation that's going to be online is we're going to talk about a definition of resources. So depending on what you're doing, if you've wondered, what's the best way to make this work? Or I have a new React app and I'm trying to do the hybrid authorization flow. What's the best package or library to do that? We could spend a good amount of time on that, but then only certain core people would be really getting something out of that. So there's a lot of links and items there that people have covered for those situations. And I'll be tweeting this in just a second as far as the PowerPoint, in case you want to access it. Any more questions? I think we're good. Thank you.